June 6, 1944, Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. The clock on the wall read 9:30 in the morning. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stood in the map room with his hands behind his back. His face was gray with worry. He had not slept in 2 days. All around him, officers rushed back and forth with papers and radio reports. Phones rang constantly. The biggest military invasion in human history was happening right now, and Eisenhower was the man in charge of it all. The reports coming in were not good. At a beach called Omaha, American soldiers were dying by the hundreds. They were pinned down on the sand. German machine guns cut them down as soon as they left their boats. At another beach called Sword, British troops were struggling to move forward. The Germans were fighting hard. The invasion that was supposed to sweep across France was stuck. Men were dying on 5 different beaches, and Eisenhower could only wait and hope and pray that his plan would work. Then a young officer rushed into the room. He carried a single piece of paper. His hand shook as he gave it to Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander read it once. Then he read it again. His eyes went wide. He looked up at his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. Eisenhower's voice was quiet, but everyone in the room heard him. He said, "The Canadians are through. 47 minutes. The room went silent. Every officer stopped what they were doing. 47 minutes. The Canadians had broken through the Atlantic Wall in 47 minutes. This was the story everyone would talk about for the rest of the war. This was the moment that changed everything." What Eisenhower said next to his staff would reveal something important about why a small nation of just 11 million people could do what seemed impossible. But first, you need to understand just how impossible it really was. Juno Beach was one of 5 landing zones that day. The Canadians were given a 6-mile stretch of sand between 2 small French towns. Intelligence reports said that 3,000 German soldiers defended that beach. But it was worse than that. The Germans had spent 4 years turning Juno Beach into a killing ground. They built concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick. They placed machine gun nests every 100 yards. They put mines everywhere. Thousands and thousands of mines buried in the sand and hidden under the water. They built walls of steel shaped like giant jacks that would rip the bottoms out of boats. They topped everything with barbed wire that could slice a man to pieces. And behind it all sat massive 88mm guns that could destroy a tank with one shot. The Canadian soldiers knew the odds. Some units were told to expect 50% casualties in the first wave. That meant 1 out of every 2 men would be killed or wounded in the first few minutes. 50%. Half of them would not make it off the beach alive. The Canadians had another reason to be afraid. 2 years earlier, in 1942, Canadian soldiers had tried to raid the French town of Dieppe. It was a disaster. 907 Canadians died in a single day. Nearly 2,000 were captured. The men landing at Juno Beach remembered Dieppe. They remembered their friends who died there. They knew what could go wrong. But Juno Beach was just one small part of something much bigger. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel. They came in 5,000 ships. They were protected by 11,000 airplanes. This was D-Day. This was the invasion that would decide World War II. If it failed, Nazi Germany would have years to build new weapons, maybe even atomic bombs. If it failed, millions more people would die. The freedom of the entire world depended on what happened on those 5 beaches. Behind the beaches stood Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall. He called it impregnable. That means it could never be broken. It stretched for 50 miles along the French coast. The bunkers were connected by tunnels. Soldiers could move from position to position without ever going outside. The guns could fire in every direction. Hitler believed that no army could break through. He was wrong about the Canadians, but he was almost right about everyone else. Making everything worse was the weather. Eisenhower had already delayed the invasion by 1 full day because of a storm. Giant waves crashed across the English Channel. Many soldiers got seasick before they even reached France. The naval guns that were supposed to destroy the German bunkers could not aim properly because the ships were rocking so hard. Most of the German positions survived the bombardment. They were waiting. If Eisenhower delayed again, he would have to wait weeks for the next time the tides were right. He could not wait. He had to go now, storm or no storm. So the question that burned in everyone's mind was this. The Americans were dying at Omaha Beach. The British were struggling at Sword Beach. But somehow, the Canadians broke through in less than an hour. They faced one of the most heavily defended sectors. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. The Germans were ready for them. So what did the Canadians do that no one expected? What made them different? What did they know that others did not? And what exactly did Eisenhower tell his staff when he heard the news that would explain why this small nation could achieve the impossible? The answer begins months before D-Day, with one general who dared to think differently. Major General Rod Keller was not like the other generals planning the invasion. He was 42 years old and came from a regular Canadian family. He did not graduate from fancy military schools in England. He learned warfare by doing it, by studying it, by thinking about what worked and what did not. And what he thought about most was Dieppe. Keller had studied the Dieppe disaster obsessively. He talked to survivors. He looked at the timing. He counted the minutes. And he saw something that nobody else seemed to see. The problem at Dieppe was not that the Canadians were too aggressive. The problem was they were not aggressive enough. They landed in waves, spaced 3 minutes apart. That meant soldiers sat on the beach waiting for the next wave to arrive. They became targets. The Germans had time to aim, time to fire, time to kill. The kill zone on a beach is the space between the water and the enemy guns. The longer you stay in that zone, the more men die. It was simple math. Terrible math. Keller's idea was radical. Instead of 3 minutes between waves, he wanted 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Not 3 minutes. Just half a minute. British commanders thought he was crazy. American advisors said it would cause chaos. The boats would crash into each other. The formations would break down. Soldiers would get confused. It violated every rule about amphibious assaults. But Keller did the math. If waves came 30 seconds apart, the beach would flood with men so fast the Germans could not target them properly. By the time German gunners aimed at one group, another group would already be past them. The beach would never be empty, but also never crowded in one spot. It would be like a river flowing inland, constant, unstoppable. Keller proposed something else unusual too. He wanted special tanks. The British had invented strange-looking tanks they called Hobart's Funnies. Some tanks had big drums on the front that exploded mines as they rolled forward. Some tanks carried huge bundles of logs they could drop into ditches to make bridges. Some had flamethrowers, others had massive mortars. Most commanders thought these tanks were unnecessary. Too complicated. Too risky. Keller wanted as many as he could get. He requested 80 specialized tanks for Juno Beach. That was more than any other landing zone would have. Then came the training. Keller told his men they would practice the landing over and over until they could do it in their sleep. Behind Canadian lines in England, engineers built a copy of Juno Beach. They used wood and tape and stakes in the ground. They made it exact. Every German trench, every bunker, every gun position. The mock battlefield was 2 full acres. It took 3 weeks to build. For 6 months, Canadian soldiers practiced on that fake beach. They would run the landing drill dozens of times each day. A whistle would blow. They would advance exactly 100 yards. Stop. Take cover. 3 minutes later, another whistle. Another 100 yards forward. Over and over. Each man memorized exactly where he needed to go. Each soldier knew his route by heart. What shocked other armies most was what each Canadian soldier carried. Maps. Detailed maps showing the entire battlefield. In British and French and American armies, only officers got maps. Regular soldiers were expected to follow orders without knowing the big picture, but Keller gave maps to every single Canadian private. Farmers who joined the army a year ago were studying these maps like generals. They knew where the German strongpoints were. They knew where artillery would fire. They knew what to do if their sergeant was killed. British generals came to inspect the Canadian training. One admiral watched the rehearsals and shook his head. He told Keller that waves 30 seconds apart would create a disaster. The formations would collapse, ships would collide, men would shoot each other in the confusion. Every military manual said you needed time between waves, time to organize, time to assess, time to consolidate. Keller listened politely. Then he asked a simple question. How many men did conventional tactics lose at Dieppe? The admiral looked uncomfortable. Over 2,000 casualties, he admitted. And how much ground did we gain? Keller asked. The admiral said nothing. They both knew the answer. No ground. All those men died for nothing. But Keller had one important supporter. Admiral Percy Nels commanded the Royal Canadian Navy. He had also studied Dieppe. He had also done the math. Nels understood that being careful on a beach just meant dying slowly instead of dying quickly. When British command complained about Keller's unorthodox methods, Nels defended him. Let the Canadians try it their way, Nels argued. The old way got 900 men killed. What do we have to lose by trying something different? The Canadians were also working with fewer resources than the Americans. The American landing at Omaha Beach had over 350 ships. The Canadians at Juno had 110 ships. They had fewer landing craft, fewer men in the first waves. Less time to get everyone ashore. This forced them to be more efficient. Every boat mattered. Every second counted. There was no room for waste. As June approached, the training intensified. Tank crews practiced driving off landing craft in rough water. They did it 50 times, 60 times, until they could do it blind. Infantry practiced moving behind the tanks, staying close, using the armor for protection. Engineers rehearsed blowing holes in seawalls with Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives that could blast through concrete and steel. The specialized tanks were the key to everything. 29 swimming tanks would launch from ships and drive through the water to shore. The mine flail tanks would go first, their spinning drums exploding buried mines. Then the regular tanks with heavy armor. Then the flamethrower tanks shooting fire into German bunkers. Then infantry right behind, protected by all that steel. On June 5th, the night before the invasion, Keller walked among his men. They were loading onto ships. Some played cards, some wrote letters home, some prayed. Everyone was scared. Keller did not give them a big speech about glory or heroism. He reminded them of their training. He told them they knew what to do. He told them to trust their maps, trust their training, trust each other. And whatever happened, keep moving forward. Do not stop. The only way off the beach alive was straight through the German guns. At 7:45 on the morning of June 6th, the first wave of Canadians would hit Juno Beach. Everything Keller planned would be tested. Either his ideas would work, or thousands of men would die proving him wrong. There would be no second chance, no do-overs. Just one terrible moment when theory became reality, and careful planning met brutal combat. The next hour would decide everything. At exactly 7:45 in the morning, the first Canadian landing craft hit the beach at Juno. The ramps dropped down, cold seawater splashed up. Canadian soldiers ran forward into water that came up to their chests. The roar of naval guns firing behind them mixed with the sound of German machine guns firing ahead. Bullets hit the water like rain. Explosions threw up fountains of sand and spray. The air filled with smoke and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Then, just 30 seconds later, the second wave hit the beach. Then the third, then the fourth. Wave after wave, 30 seconds apart. The beach filled with men and tanks so fast the Germans could barely believe what they were seeing. They expected groups they could target one at a time. Instead, they faced a flood of steel and soldiers that never stopped coming. The specialized tanks rolled off the landing craft and went to work immediately. The mine flail tanks went first. Their big drums spun and exploded buried mines with loud bangs. Safe paths opened through the minefields. Behind them came regular tanks, their guns firing at German bunkers. The sound was incredible. 180 tank engines running at full power. The roar was louder than any artillery. The ground shook. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with salt water and smoke made a thick fog. Inside the tanks, crews were getting thrown around as they rolled over rough sand. The suspension bounced so hard some men bit their tongues and tasted blood. Through their periscopes they could see German bunkers. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark slits in the concrete. German shells screamed past. Some hit close enough that crews could hear the whistle. One round hit a tank's side armor and left a bright scar but did not punch through. The Canadian infantry ran behind the tanks. The armor protected them from machine gun bullets that would have cut them down in the open. German gunners tried to aim, but the targets were moving too fast. By the time they lined up a shot, the Canadians were already past them. The 30-second spacing meant the beach was never empty but also never crowded. Men flowed forward like water, finding the path of least resistance. At 8:20 in the morning, just 35 minutes after landing, the Regina rifles reached the seawall. They placed explosives against the concrete. The charges went off with huge booms. Holes opened up. Canadian soldiers poured through into the town of Courseulles. German soldiers in the streets were eating breakfast when Canadians burst in. Some Germans grabbed their weapons. Others put up their hands to surrender. The Canadians were not supposed to be in the town yet. The plan said it would take hours to break through. But here they were, 35 minutes after landing. At 8:36 in the morning, 47 minutes after the first wave hit the beach, a Canadian radio operator sent a message back to the ships. His hands shook as he tapped out the words. Juno Beach secure. Proceeding inland. The message was sent to command ships. From there it went to British headquarters. From there it reached Eisenhower at Southwick House. Back at the beach, the contrast with predictions was stunning. Canadian commanders had been told to expect 50 to 60% casualties in the first wave. That meant out of every 100 men, 50 or 60 would be killed or wounded. But the actual numbers were different. 340 Canadians died on June 6th. 574 were wounded. Those numbers were terrible. Each one was a man who would never go home. But it was half what the planners predicted. Half. That meant hundreds of men were still alive who were expected to die. Meanwhile, at Omaha Beach, American soldiers were still pinned down at the waterline. At noon, 12 hours after landing began, they had barely moved off the sand. Bodies floated in the surf. Burning tanks sent up black smoke. The Americans were brave. They were well trained, but they followed the old doctrine. Land in waves spaced 3 minutes apart. Consolidate. Move carefully. And they were dying by the thousands. At Utah Beach, the other American landing zone, progress was better but still slow. By the end of the day, Americans at Utah advanced about 6 miles. At Gold Beach, where British forces landed using conventional tactics, they made it about 4 miles inland. At Sword Beach, the British pushed forward but stayed close to the coast. But the Canadians at Juno Beach kept going. By 10 in the morning, 21,400 Canadian troops were ashore. By noon, forward Canadian positions were 5 miles inland. 5 miles. They had blown through the Atlantic wall that was supposed to stop them. German defenders who survived the initial assault were retreating or surrendering. Some threw down their weapons and put up their hands. Others ran. The German response came from the 21st Panzer Division. These were elite troops with the best tanks Germany had. They were supposed to counterattack and push the Canadians back into the sea. But when they tried, they found Canadian forces already too far inland. The Germans expected to fight Canadians who were still on the beach. Instead, the Canadians were behind German forward positions. The counterattack fell apart. German intelligence officers could not understand what happened. A report captured later by Allied forces showed German confusion. The document said the Canadian attack tempo was unprecedented. It said forward positions were overrun before defenders could organize. It said this Canadian commander understood armored warfare better than British or American generals the Germans had faced. The report was classified. It was meant only for German officers. It was not propaganda. It was a professional military assessment. And it named the Canadians as the most dangerous Allied force. By the end of June 6th, the statistics told a story that changed everything. The Canadians advanced 9 miles inland. 9 miles. That was deeper than any other Allied force on D-Day. They captured over 2,000 German prisoners. They destroyed or captured over 200 German gun positions, and they did it with 30 to 35% casualties instead of the predicted 60 to 70%. The unexpected consequence of Canadian success was how it helped everyone else. The Canadian breakthrough created a bulge in the German lines, a salient that stuck out toward the enemy. German commanders had to send reinforcements to stop it. Those reinforcements came from other sectors. That meant fewer Germans defending against the Americans and British. The Canadians were pulling German forces toward themselves like a magnet. While the Germans focused on stopping the Canadians, American and British forces had more time to get established. At Southwick House, Eisenhower stood looking at the map. Colored pins showed where each force had reached. The Canadian pins were pushed far inland, farther than anyone expected. His staff officers gathered around him, waiting to hear what the Supreme Commander would say about this impossible achievement. The sensory reality of the battle stayed with survivors forever. The sound of tank engines roaring, the smell of diesel and gunpowder and salt water all mixed together. The feeling of sand kicked up by tank treads, stinging exposed skin. The sight of German bunkers disappearing into smoke and dust. The taste of fear and adrenaline. The chaos where you could not see more than a few feet ahead, but you kept moving because stopping meant death. By nightfall on June 6th, the impossible had happened. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had a 9-mile hole punched through it. The Canadians had proven that the right tactics could overcome overwhelming defenses. They had shown that speed and aggression, when properly planned, saved lives instead of costing them. And they had done what no one expected a small colonial nation to do. They had led the way. When Eisenhower received the full report about the Canadian breakthrough, he read it twice. He looked at the numbers. 47 minutes from landing to securing the beach. 9 miles inland by nightfall. Half the predicted casualties. He turned to General Walter Bedell Smith, his chief of staff. Then he addressed everyone in the command room. His words that day would be remembered forever. Eisenhower said, "Gentlemen, let me tell you something about soldiers from dominions. They don't fight for empire. They don't fight for glory. They fight for each other. And that makes them the most dangerous fighters on earth." He paused and looked at the map again. "If I had known they could move that fast, I would have given them 2 beaches." The news of the Canadian success spread quickly through Allied forces. Within days, American and British commanders started asking questions. How did the Canadians do it? What was different about their tactics? Could these methods work elsewhere? Officers who had dismissed Keller's ideas before D-Day suddenly wanted to learn from him. The 30-second wave spacing, the specialized tanks working together, the maps given to every soldier, all of it. By July 1944, the British Army started changing how they trained for beach assaults. They shortened the time between waves. They gave more information to regular soldiers. They practiced faster, more aggressive advances. The Americans did the same. Training manuals that were written before D-Day were thrown out. New manuals were written based on what the Canadians proved worked, but Major General Rod Keller never saw the full impact of what he created. On July 8th, just 1 month after D-Day, German artillery hit his command post near the city of Caen. Shrapnel tore through his leg and back. He was evacuated to a hospital in England. The wounds were serious. He survived, but his days of commanding troops in combat were over. The war in Europe continued for another 10 months without him. When Keller finally recovered enough to travel, he returned to Canada. The war was still raging, but he was done fighting. He was given desk jobs. He attended ceremonies. He gave speeches. But he never led soldiers in battle again. The injury had ended his career at the moment of his greatest triumph. He was still just 42 years old, and his war was over. After the war ended in 1945, Keller received surprisingly little public recognition. There were parades for returning soldiers. There were monuments built. There were ceremonies and medals, but Keller's name was not famous. Most Canadians knew about Juno Beach. They knew about the brave soldiers who landed there, but they did not know the name of the general who planned the tactics that made it successful. Keller was not a man who sought attention. He did not write a memoir. He did not give many interviews. He did not try to become famous. He just went back to a quiet life. In 1954, at the age of 52, Rod Keller died. His obituary in Canadian newspapers was short. It mentioned his service in the war. It noted that he commanded Canadian forces at Juno Beach, but it did not explain what he had accomplished. Most people who read it did not understand that this man had changed how modern armies fight. While Keller faded from public memory, his tactics lived on and grew stronger. In 1946, the United States Military Academy at West Point added a new course to their training. It was called the Juno Beach Case Study. Officers learned about aggressive wave spacing, about specialized armor coordination, about giving soldiers complete information instead of just orders. The lessons became required knowledge for anyone who wanted to command troops. The British Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst did the same thing. British officers who had criticized Keller's methods before D-Day now taught those same methods to new generations of soldiers. The French military, which had suffered over 1 million casualties in World War I using old tactics, completely redesigned their training based on what the Canadians proved at Juno Beach. By 1949, when NATO was formed, Canadian doctrine became the foundation for how all member nations would fight. The aggressive assault tactics, the emphasis on speed through danger zones, the practice of training every soldier to understand the mission. All of it came from Juno Beach, from a small nation that most military experts had underestimated, from a general who was not from a famous military family or a fancy academy. The principle was simple, but it changed everything. Give soldiers the knowledge they need to make good decisions. Trust them to think. Prepare them thoroughly before sending them into battle. Then, when the moment comes, move so fast the enemy cannot react. Speed saves lives. Hesitation kills. The Canadians proved it with statistics that could not be argued with. Modern military forces around the world still teach these lessons. Every major military academy studies the Battle of Juno Beach. They show the numbers, they explain the tactics, they walk through Keller's decisions. The lesson they teach is simple but hard to follow. When conventional methods are not working, you need courage to try something different, even if everyone says you are wrong, especially if everyone says you are wrong. The story teaches us something deeper than military tactics. It teaches us about innovation and where it comes from. The British had fought wars for centuries. They had military traditions going back hundreds of years. The Americans had huge resources and modern equipment. But it was the Canadians, from a nation of just 11 million people, who found the better way. Why? Because the Canadians had something to prove. They carried the shame of Dieppe. They had been dismissed as colonial troops. They had been underestimated by everyone. That gave them freedom to question everything. They could not afford to just follow tradition. They had to find what actually worked. Sometimes the outsider sees what the expert misses because the expert is trapped by what worked before. The Canadians also fought for different reasons. Eisenhower was right about that. They were not fighting for empire or conquest. They were fighting because their friends and brothers were fighting. They were fighting to go home. That kind of motivation is powerful. It makes men willing to try new things, willing to take risks, willing to think instead of just follow orders. Today, 80 years after D-Day, the lessons of Juno Beach still matter, not just for military forces but for anyone facing impossible problems. When everyone says something cannot be done, when the experts all agree on the conventional wisdom, that is exactly when someone needs to ask if there is a better way. The safe approach is not always safe. Sometimes the riskiest thing is playing it safe. Small groups can accomplish what large organizations cannot. The Canadians proved that 14,000 soldiers with the right tactics could achieve more than hundreds of thousands using wrong tactics. Size matters less than how you use what you have. Resources matter less than preparation and planning. And courage matters most when it means questioning what everyone else accepts as truth. The story of Juno Beach reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger is doing what everyone else does just because that is how it has always been done. Sometimes survival requires running toward the danger instead of away from it. Sometimes the only way through is straight through. Those lessons applied on a French beach in 1944. They apply in boardrooms and classrooms and hospitals and homes today. The situations change, but the truth remains. Rod Keller never became famous. No movies were made about him. No best-selling books told his story. But every soldier who studies modern warfare learns from what he created. Every NATO officer knows the principles he established. His legacy is not in monuments or medals. His legacy is in the thousands of lives saved by tactics that value preparation over tradition, speed over caution, and trusting soldiers to think over simply following orders. That legacy lives on every time a military force trains for battle. Every time they practice moving fast through danger. Every time they give knowledge to every person instead of keeping it at the top. In those moments, Rod Keller's ghost stands with them, reminding them that sometimes the hardest battles are won by those brave enough to fight differently.